Picture this. The year is 1323 BC, and within the golden walls of a pharaoh's palace in ancient Thebes, a ceremony is about to begin that would horrify even the most hardened modern observer. The air thick with incense and the flickering light of oil lamps casting dancing shadows across hieroglyph-covered walls. A young woman barely past her 14th birthday is being prepared for a ritual that will bind her not just to her husband, but to the very gods themselves. She trembles not from cold, but from the weight of what she knows must come. For in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's sexual practices weren't just personal choices. They were sacred obligations that determined the fate of kingdoms, the flooding of the Nile, and the favor of the gods themselves. What you're about to discover in this video will challenge everything you think you know about ancient Egyptian civilization. Behind the golden masks and magnificent pyramids lay practices so disturbing, so psychologically damaging, and so systematically brutal that they were hidden from common knowledge for over 3,000 years. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of mad rulers. These were institutionalized customs that shaped the very foundation of pharaonic power, passed down through dynasty after dynasty like sacred commandments carved in stone. I've spent months researching ancient papyri, examining archaeological evidence, and consulting with leading Egyptologists to bring you the complete truth about what really happened behind the closed doors of Egypt's most powerful rulers. What you'll learn today goes far beyond simple historical curiosity. These practices reveal the darkest aspects of absolute power and the lengths to which human beings will go to maintain control over others. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why these rituals were considered so essential to pharaonic rule that they continued for over 2 millennia, and why their psychological impact echoed through generations of Egyptian society. The first practice that defined pharaonic sexual customs was the sacred marriage between siblings. But this wasn't the romanticized version you might have learned in school textbooks. The reality was far more calculated and infinitely more disturbing than most people realize. Royal incest in ancient Egypt served multiple purposes that extended far beyond simple political alliance. The pharaoh was considered the living embodiment of the god Horus, and his sister wife represented the goddess Isis. Their union wasn't just symbolic, it was believed to literally maintain the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and protected from chaos. But the psychological toll of these arranged marriages, often between children who had grown up together as siblings, created a unique form of trauma that affected entire royal bloodlines. Consider the case of Pharaoh Amenhotep II, who ruled during the 18th dynasty around 1427 BC. Historical records indicate that he was married to his full sister Tia when both were still children, possibly as young as 12 and 10 years old respectively. But the marriage wasn't consummated immediately. Instead, they underwent years of ritualistic preparation that involved increasingly intimate ceremonies designed to bond them not as siblings, but as divine counterparts. These preparatory rituals included shared baths in sacred pools, where priests would anoint their bodies with oils while reciting incantations. Joint meditation sessions where they would lie naked together while maintaining perfect stillness for hours. And ceremonial feedings where they would consume aphrodisiac compounds made from exotic herbs and animal secretions. The psychological manipulation involved in transforming a natural sibling relationship into a sexual partnership required sophisticated techniques that Egyptian priests had perfected over centuries. Young royal siblings were gradually separated from normal family interactions and placed in isolated chambers where their only human contact came from specially trained servants who referred to them not by their birth names, but by their future divine titles. They were taught to see each other not as brother and sister, but as two halves of a single divine entity that could only achieve completeness through physical union. But the most disturbing aspect of royal sibling marriage wasn't the initial ceremony. It was the ongoing expectation that these couples would perform their intimate relationships as public rituals during major religious festivals. Several times each year, the pharaoh and his sister wife will require and record Evrid to consummate their marriage in full priests, who would observe view of the high detail to ensure that the divine union was proceeding according to ancient protocols. These observers didn't simply watch passively. They provided detailed instructions throughout the encounter, directing specific positions, timing, and even breathing patterns that were believed necessary to maintain cosmic harmony. The second practice that defined pharaonic sexual customs and control of concubines involved the systematic collection, conquered territories, but again was far more organized, the realityed than simple imperial and psychologically sophisticated conquest. When Egyptian armies conquered new territories, they didn't just collect random beautiful women as spoils of war. They implemented a careful selection process that identified specific types of individuals who could serve particular ritual functions within the pharaoh's sexual hierarchy. Young women with certain physical characteristics were chosen not for their beauty, but for their supposed spiritual properties. Those with unusual eye colors were believed to possess supernatural sight that could help the pharaoh see into the future during intimate encounters. Women with distinctive birthmarks or scars were thought to carry messages from the gods written on their flesh. Even specific body proportions were considered indicative of divine favor or cosmic significance. These selected concubines underwent extensive training periods that could last several years before they were ever permitted to approach the pharaoh. The training wasn't simply about learning to please a powerful man. It involved complete psychological reconstruction designed to strip away their original identities and replace them with carefully crafted personas that served specific ritual purposes. They were taught specialized languages used only in intimate settings, learned to interpret the pharaoh's dreams and visions, and mastered complex dance sequences that were believed to invoke particular gods during sexual encounters. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic way these women were isolated from any possibility of forming emotional attachments outside their service to the pharaoh. They lived in specially constructed quarters within the palace complex that were designed to prevent them from developing relationships with guards, servants, or even each other. The architecture itself was a form of psychological control, with corridors that prevented private conversations, chambers that could be monitored from hidden passages, and gardens where every bench and pathway was positioned to eliminate any possibility of intimate discussion between concubines. The pharaoh's interactions with these women followed rigid protocols that were recorded in detail by palace scribes. These weren't romantic encounters or even simple physical gratification. They were carefully choreographed rituals where each woman played a specific role in elaborate ceremonies designed to channel divine energy through the pharaoh's body. Some concubines were designated as representatives of particular goddesses and were only approached during certain phases of the moon or specific seasonal festivals. Others were assigned to embody abstract concepts like victory in battle or abundant harvest, and intimate encounters with them were timed to coincide with military campaigns or agricultural cycles. The psychological impact on these women was carefully monitored and documented by palace physicians who specialized in what they called diseases of the heart and mind. Historical records describe symptoms that we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and dissociative conditions brought on by the extreme isolation and dehumanization of their circumstances. But rather than treating these conditions as problems to be solved, Egyptian court physicians viewed them as necessary transformations that made the women more suitable for their divine purposes. The third and perhaps most psychologically damaging practice involved the systematic training of the pharaoh's own children in sexual techniques and behaviors that would prepare them for their future roles as divine rulers. But this training began at ages that would shock modern sensibilities and involved methods that deliberately traumatized young minds to reshape their understanding of intimacy and power. Royal children in ancient Egypt were removed from their mothers at the age of 7. and placed under the care of specialized priest educators who began their sexual instruction immediately. These weren't gentle lessons about the birds and the bees. They were intensive psychological conditioning programs designed to prepare future pharaohs for the complex sexual obligations that would define their reigns. The training began with what palace records called purification rituals, where young princes and princesses were bathed together by adult attendants who would touch and examine their bodies while explaining the divine significance of each anatomical feature. These sessions occurred daily and gradually became more intimate as the children grew older. By age 10, royal children were required to participate in mock marriage ceremonies with other palace children, complete with simulated consummation rituals that were observed and critiqued by their instructors. The most disturbing aspect of this early training involved the deliberate cultivation of what Egyptian texts describe as sacred detachment. Children were taught to separate their emotional responses from their physical experiences, viewing their bodies not as personal possessions, but as instruments of divine will. This psychological dissociation was achieved through techniques that would be recognized today as systematic abuse, but in ancient Egypt, it was considered essential preparation for the burdens of godlike leadership. Young princes underwent specialized training in sexual dominance that went far beyond simple technique. They learned to read subtle signs of fear, submission, and resistance in others, and were taught to use these observations to maintain psychological control over future subjects and sexual partners. The training included detailed instruction in the use of pain, pleasure, and emotional manipulation as tools of statecraft. These weren't theoretical lessons. Palace records indicate that young princes practiced these techniques on carefully selected servants and slaves, who were considered expendable training materials. The psychological conditioning extended to every aspect of the children's daily lives. They ate meals while naked servants fed them by hand, teaching them to associate physical vulnerability in others with their own power and pleasure. They learned to give commands through touch rather than words, developing an intuitive understanding of how physical contact could be used to communicate dominance and submission. Most disturbing of all, they were taught to view emotional distress in others not as something to be avoided or remedied, but as confirmation of their divine authority. The fourth practice that defined pharaonic sexual control involved the systematic use of religious festivals as opportunities for mass sexual exploitation disguised as spiritual celebration. But the reality of these events reveals a level of organized brutality that surpassed even the cruelest excesses of Roman emperors. The festival of Opet, held annually in Thebes, ostensibly celebrated the renewed fertility of the Nile and the divine marriage between the pharaoh and the goddess Mut. But surviving papyri describe events that went far beyond ceremonial symbolism. During the 3-week festival, the pharaoh was expected to demonstrate his divine virility through public sexual encounters with dozens of women, representing different aspects of Egyptian society. These weren't willing participants in a joyous celebration. They were women who had been selected months in advance through a process that was essentially sanctified kidnapping. Palace officials would travel throughout Egypt, identifying women who met specific criteria for the festival. Married women whose husbands had recently died were considered especially valuable because their grief was thought to make them more receptive to divine transformation. Young mothers were selected because their ability to nurture children supposedly made them ideal vessels for channeling the pharaoh's divine essence. Even elderly women were chosen if they possessed particular skills like midwifery or herb knowledge that could be symbolically absorbed by the pharaoh through intimate contact. These women were brought to Thebes under the pretense of religious honor, told they had been chosen to serve the gods in a sacred capacity. They were housed in temporary structures built specifically for the festival, fed ritual foods containing mind-altering substances, and subjected to days of preparatory ceremonies designed to break down their psychological resistance. By the time they encountered the pharaoh, many were in altered states of consciousness that made meaningful consent impossible. The actual festival events were choreographed spectacles of power and domination performed before audiences of nobles, priests, and foreign dignitaries. The pharaohs' sexual encounters with festival participants weren't private affairs, but public demonstrations of divine authority. The women's responses, whether pleasure, pain, or terror, were interpreted by attending priests as messages from the gods about Egypt's future prosperity. Screams were considered particularly auspicious, viewed as evidence that divine power was successfully flowing through the pharaoh's body into the mortal realm. But the festival's most horrific aspect was its aftermath. Women who survived their encounters with the pharaoh weren't returned to their homes and families. They were considered permanently transformed by their contact with divine essence and could never resume normal lives. Some were kept as permanent temple servants. Others were distributed among high-ranking nobles as rewards for loyalty, and many simply disappeared into the vast network of palace labor that kept Egyptian civilization functioning. The psychological manipulation required to maintain these practices involved an entire infrastructure of religious justification that touched every level of Egyptian society. Children grew up hearing stories that portrayed these festivals as glorious celebrations where chosen women achieved the highest possible honor. Young girls were taught to aspire to selection, viewing it as the ultimate expression of their worth and beauty. This cultural conditioning made resistance not just dangerous, but psychologically difficult, as victims had been programmed from childhood to interpret their abuse as divine blessing. The fifth and final practice that reveals the true horror of pharaonic sexual control involved the systematic breeding programs designed to produce children with specific characteristics for ritual purposes. But these weren't simple dynastic marriages aimed at producing heirs. They were calculated experiments in human manipulation that treated children as products to be manufactured according to precise specifications. These practices that we've uncovered today represent more than just historical curiosity. They reveal the darkest possibilities of absolute power when combined with religious authority and cultural manipulation. For over 2 millennia, the pharaohs of Egypt maintained control through systematic sexual exploitation disguised as divine obligation, creating trauma that echoed through generations of their civilization. The golden treasures and magnificent monuments that we admire today were built upon foundations of unimaginable human suffering, reminding us that even the most glorious civilizations can harbor secrets too terrible for their own people to acknowledge.